Record. Okay, we're recording now. So welcome to this empathy circle, where we're going to be talking about the role of empathy and how it relates to the memo by James Damore called Google's Ideological Echo Chamber. And we'll do some introductions. I'm Edwin Rutch, and I've been working for maybe over 10 years now on how do we build a more empathic culture. So I've been doing hundreds of interviews, have done perhaps over 300 interviews, and those 2 rows of books back there are all about empathy, and I've interviewed most of the authors there. And I've set up, our center has set up a social media community. We have about 30,000 people on Facebook. We curate a magazine, an online magazine, which has about almost 8,000 articles from online articles, and offer empathic listening, facilitation, empathy circle facilitation, and training and mediation. And so have all kinds of different projects on how to build a more empathic culture. And we're here today with James Damore, and James is was a senior software engineer, was fired for writing his memo entitled, like I just said, Google's Ideological Echo Chamber. And would you like to say more about it for your own introduction, James?
Yeah, I guess just to discuss the document a little bit, it was really trying to bring more perspectives into the discussion and really empower people to not feel so alienated in Google's culture.
Okay, thank you. And we have Lou. Would you like to introduce yourself, Lou?
Sure, I'm Lou Zweier. I am a filmmaker and teacher. I teach communication and conflict resolution. I also teach leadership in a program in Sacramento. And part of my experience that's relevant maybe to this conversation, other than communication and conflict resolution, is that I'm a former director of academic technology for the California State University system. I had like a 27-year career in technology and learning. So I know a little bit about technology environments and technology people and communication, like what goes on in Google software development environments.
Oh, okay. You remind me of there, Lou, I also have a background in technology. Before I got into this world of empathy and building a culture of empathy, I was a system administrator, wrote 3 books on computers. They were buyer guides and handbooks on how to buy PC clones in the olden days, and had worked as a system administrator at Xerox PARC, which is the research center in Silicon Valley. So what we're wanting to do here in this discussion is to talk about specifically the relationship of empathy and what your paper that you wrote, your memo. And we've had a lot of different discussions about it. We've talked, personally in a non-recorded call. I sent you material about it. In our last empathy circle, we talked with Indy a little bit about it, but this dialogue was going to be specifically, sort of around that topic. And this discussion that we use, the process we use, is we call it an empathy circle, dialogue process, and it has certain rules and structures to it. And Lou was going to introduce the process before we begin.
Sure. So, and we've all participated in this before, so this explanation really is just for the people watching. So an empathy circle is just a little bit different than a regular conversation in that the amount of time that each person speaks is timed. So there's a 5-minute limit. You don't have to use the 5 minutes, but you have up to 5 minutes to say something, whatever's on your mind, whatever you want to say in the conversation. And when it's a person's turn, let's say it's my turn, I pick someone to listen to me. So either Edwin or James, or if the circle were larger, be someone else. But I pick the person that I want to reflect back to me what I'm saying. And others in the circle are listening silently. But the person who's selected to reflect back, gives the person their full attention. And then periodically during the 5 minutes, they reflect back what they are understanding the person is saying, both maybe the feelings and the meaning that they're getting from the person. And the idea is to reflect that back until the speaker is satisfied. So you reflect it back and you say, so am I getting, is that right? And if the speaker says, yeah, that's great, or the speaker says, no, that's not quite it. There was this piece that you were missing. There's kind of a back and forth like that. And generally, the speaker doesn't go a whole 5 minutes before they get reflected back, because that's usually too much information to take in. So the speaker, the listener can either say, well, hold on a second, can you wait for a minute? Let me reflect back what I'm hearing so far. Or the speaker can just pause to allow that. Or sometimes if neither of those happen, someone else in the circle can say, well, hold on a second, why don't you pause there and let the listener reflect back? Sometimes listeners are reluctant to interrupt and say, hang on a second, I need to reflect back. And then so when a person is done speaking, either when the time is up or just when they feel done, if the speaker's feeling fully heard, you can cue that you're done with your turn by saying, I feel fully heard. And then the person who is the listener, it's their turn to talk for up to 5 minutes, and they select someone in the circle to listen to them. And generally, the listening is passed around so that everybody gets a chance to listen and talk. There's no requirement about who you pick, but generally it's passed around so that everyone has a chance to speak and listen. I think that's it. Anything else?
Yeah, that was very clear. And okay. So we can get started, and I'll actually just to demonstrate. I'll begin and I'll speak to.
So I am going to keep time,
mm-hmm.
And this is what it's going to sound like when the time is up. Can you hear that?
Yep.
Okay, so that's an audio cue, so that I don't have to interrupt. If you hear that audio, then your time is up and you can finish up what you're saying. Is that okay if we use an audio cue?
Works for me.
Sure.
Okay. That's all right with you, James?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Okay, then I'll actually start just to demonstrate, and I'll speak to you, Lou. Okay. And the first thing that comes, up for me, just about how I am now, is I feel very grateful for James being so open to talk. It's like, he is like amazing. It's like, we reach out to him. He says, sure, I'll talk to you. I've been looking at his interviews online. It looks like he talks to anybody. So I'm very grateful for him for taking part in this and being so open to dialogue.
So what I'm hearing is you feel grateful that James is so open and willing to listen. You see online and in various ways that he's willing to listen to lots of people. He's open to communication and listening. And I think I'm getting a little surprise, maybe too. Gratitude and surprise. Is there some surprise there too?
Initially surprised, but not surprised anymore. I've just seen it's part of his personality to be kind of have this openness to him.
And that makes you happy. There's
some
joyfulness there. I'm seeing you smile. So.
Yeah. Okay. And also in his memo, he repeatedly talks about, hey, this is about dialogue. How do we foster more dialogue? So I really see that quality in him, that he's really values dialogue, and I see him manifesting that too.
So you were happy to see both in his writing and in his behavior that he's very into dialogue, very much wanting dialogue, and that the purpose of his memo was to create dialogue, not to try to dominate anyone, or make some kind of big political statement, but more to open a dialogue.
Yeah, and I'm also very grateful for you being part of this, because in terms of fostering empathy and having sort of an empathic personality, you're one of the most empathic people I know. So I feel like in really good hands, just having you here and being present.
So you're also great. So I'm hearing you're also grateful for my presence, because you respect my skill and my experience, and you feel very supported by me being here, and you're just really happy that this is happening. I see, again, a big smile on your face while you're talking.
Yeah, I feel fully heard. Thank you for that.
Okay. So I guess it's my turn to talk. So I'll talk to James.
Sure.
So I'm not sure what I want to talk about. Let's see. Well, what I'm feeling is appreciation. I feel very appreciated by what you just said, Edwin. I'm also grateful to you for the work that you're doing, trying to build a culture of empathy and trying to create constructive dialogue. And one of the reasons that I reconnected with you in the last 3 months, we've known each other for about 10 years, or we met about 10 years ago, is because when I saw what you were doing, trying to do constructive dialogue, where I see all the time, I hear people say, and I see all the time people wanting constructive dialogue, saying, we need to have more constructive dialogue, but like there are no contexts for doing that. So like, where do you go to have a constructive dialogue? And so you're really working hard to create those things, including this one. And I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate in that.
Right. So you first appreciated what Edwin said, and also you're really grateful for all the things that he's been doing to encourage more constructive dialogue and a culture of empathy.
Yes, thank you. And then I'm also grateful to you, James, for being willing to participate in this. Much like Edwin said, I can only imagine what it's been like for you to have, experienced what you did at Google and have some thoughts and feelings about that, some strong feelings about that. I read your memo before the call, which I had not done. I'd seen a lot of the media stuff, and I think maybe I'd read little bits of it, but I never really read the whole thing. And so, to be, to try to express yourself, your thoughts, and in what you were trying to do in a constructive way, and then to have the things happen that happened to you, I imagine that was shocking and surprising and hurt maybe. And so for you to be willing to, not just run away or hide, but to try to have constructive dialogue about it, I think I respect that.
So as you appreciate me coming on this, and that you saw that in the document I was trying to just express my thoughts and feelings, but maybe there, and you appreciate that this, was that Edwin's timer? Or?
No, that was the 5 minutes, and that's my 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. Well, so you appreciate that even if like I've been so harshly treated in the media, that I'm not just like running away, but I'm still trying to create a dialogue.
Yes. And I'm going to take one more minute because this is important to me. I just want to say I didn't agree with everything that was in the memo. I said I read the memo and I respect you for doing what you did. So I don't want people to misinterpret that, to think that I agreed with everything you said in the memo. I don't. But so I just wanted to make that clear.
Yeah, so yeah, you don't agree with everything that I wrote.
Okay. Thank you. I feel fully heard.
And
so it's your turn now.
I guess I'll talk to Edwin.
Okay.
So yeah, I definitely appreciate both of you, what you said, and also just your efforts to try to create more dialogue. So that's something that I value, and it's great that you two are also doing that.
So I'm hearing real appreciation that we're trying to create some dialogue here, and it's something that you're valuing as well. So really hearing a sense of appreciation for that.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, so I see a lot of problems happening, both in politics, the workplace, and even relationships, where the root cause seems to be just a lack of dialogue and a lack of trying to understand the other person's perspective. And we so often assume that everyone has the same perspective that we do, that if they do something that we wouldn't do, then we infer that they have bad intentions.
Sorry.
Okay, so you're saying that you value dialogue and you would like to foster dialogue, and one of the main problems you see in relationships, in work, in politics is people aren't dialoguing with each other, and that when people hear something that they maybe don't like, they're like assuming the worst of intentions behind it, and then instead of stepping into a dialogue to really hear and understand what the person's even saying.
Right. And, just to take the workplace or even relationship where there's these gender dynamics happening, like men often treat other people how they would want to be treated, and same with women. And when there's differences between those, then people will interpret that as mistreatment. And so that's unfortunately causing a lot of pain and misunderstanding, I think, when because it's not necessarily that people are being treated differently, but it's that people have different expectations. And so once we understand what people's expectations are and really stop assuming that everyone is exactly the same, then we can create a more inclusive workplace or even relationships between people.
Okay, so what I think I'm hearing there is that you see that men and women are treating others like how they would want to be treated themselves, instead of really hearing where the other person is. They're just making these assumptions about other people. So instead of really hearing how they want to be treated, that they're making these assumptions, and that this is causing a lot of pain. And so it's like how you're looking at how to, really address this and how to really hear the other person. I don't know if I'm quite getting that. But.
Right. Yeah, and I guess just one thing that I feel like is blocking this dialogue is this insistence that there can be no gender differences in any way, and everyone is the same, which really, like, it stops anyone from saying, oh, no, really, men tend to be this way, women tend to be this way. And, if we're seeing this dynamic play out, it may be because of that difference. And it's not necessarily that all the women are just being treated differently than the men are.
So I'm not quite sure I got that. You're saying that, wait, could you say that again? I just didn't quite get that.
So the current narrative is that all people are the same, but they're just being mistreated.
Oh, okay, so let me get that. So let me get a piece. So there's this narrative out there that all people are the same, that we're all the same same type of person, and that there's this mistreatment going on. So
yeah, and that's what's causing disparities, rather than people simply, there being some average differences, and that causing different expectations that they themselves have, and that causes them to interpret acts on them differently.
Okay, so there are differences, that people aren't seeing that there are these differences, and that people are just making these interpretations that about how, I'm not quite sure, making interpretations of, and not really seeing the person, what's really going on for them. I don't know. Do you want to finish that? I don't think I quite got the.
So in a male normative culture where masculine behavior is rewarded, men will naturally thrive in that, while women will see that as unnatural, or at least we'll see some difference in the population.
Okay, and so there's going to be.
Yeah, and that's explaining some of the workplace dynamics.
Okay, so part of the place dynamics is in technology, it's a male-dominated culture, and so there's sort of a norm there, a certain norm that people have, and that there's a part about women coming into that, and that's the part that I'm not quite sure.
Well, one example is, men tend to be much more competitive, and so women may not like that environment as much. Even if they're not being mistreated, they just won't like that environment as much as men tend to.
Oh, so there's like a value system, and when people come in that don't have that same value system, that they might feel uncomfortable.
Right.
Basically, okay. So I think that was 5 minutes too. Do you feel heard enough?
Yeah.
Okay.
I
Well,
feel
I'll speak back to you. So, one thing about the dialogue is when we have just what we call, normal, regular dialogue, is there's all these things that come up, like we were talking about, all these issues come up, all these feelings come up, and people start to, there's competition for attention, there's people being, irritated and then lashing out. So there's all these different feelings that come up and kind of can inhibit the dialogue. So I'll just start with that.
yeah, so you see that there's a lot of extra things that inhibit dialogue between people, like all these emotions and maybe outrage and people wanting just attention.
And competition for attention. So what we do here with the empathy circle, this is a process, kind of a structured dialogue process that is used in mediation, is used in the therapeutic world, and in a lot of different situations in relationship work. So one way to have these dialogues is to have a bit of a structured dialogue. So I guess I wanted to share that what we're doing here is a structured dialogue, a way of working through some of these issues that people have, these differences.
And so you see that the structure for the empathy circle really tries to it fixes some of the problems that would otherwise happen in a less structured environment.
Yeah, it creates a space where people can be heard, where someone can speak and be heard to really be understood before the turn passes on. So that's just one part, and so it slows the conversation down and offers really a deeper listening. So I guess I'm kind of trying to promote the empathy circle here.
Yeah, so you're talking about the advantages of the empathy circle and saying that it forces people to slow down and really lets everyone be heard.
Yeah, and the other part is that I did want to address the empathy part. Kind of bring it to the role of what is the role of empathy in terms of these what your memo, and you brought up empathy twice. Basically once talking about empathy in the role of systematizing and empathizing mindsets. So that's the two different mindsets. And then there was another part where you wanted to have dialogue and de-emphasize empathy in those dialogues. So that's the two places that you mentioned it. So
yeah, so you noticed that I mentioned empathy twice in the document. One about a different mindset, systemizing versus empathizing. Another when I was talking about policy level decisions and de-emphasizing empathy there.
Yeah. So I'm advocating for emphasizing empathy, that we actually, what a lot of these problems are is like an empathy deficit. And what it comes down to is, like, what are we talking about when we talk about empathy? There's like a lot of different definitions, a lot of different meanings. And I think that kind of confuses the situation. It confuses the discussion.
Yeah, so you want to clarify the discussion by, because currently it's clouded by so many different definitions and misunderstandings of what empathy is.
And I guess I'm curious, like, where did your understanding come from? And I'm wondering if it is from some of the criticisms, like from Paul Bloom and others who have kind of criticized empathy. And we've talked a little bit about that. I'm just wondering, where your understanding, comes from.
And yeah, so you're just wondering where my understanding of empathy comes from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel heard. Thank you.
So I guess I'll talk to Lou.
Yeah, hold on. Sorry, I'm restarting the timer. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So I guess I'll just try to address some of the things Edwin said. So yeah, I myself had sort of a clouded vision of what empathy was when I was writing the document. And so when I was talking about de-emphasizing empathy, I was talking about how some of these high-level policy decisions that affect thousands of people, we shouldn't necessarily favor just anecdotes and make the decision too emotional. And one example would be in charities. You don't necessarily want to determine which charity to give to just based on how sad the picture of the little girl looks. Rather, you would want to do it more on like statistics, maybe.
So let me see if I can reflect that back. So you were saying that at the time you wrote the memo, you had a lack of, not as much clarity as maybe you do now, or as you would have liked, about what empathy is. But you were concerned about, in general, you were concerned about high-level policy decisions that affect lots of people being driven by feelings about an individual person's story, or what was happening for an individual person, and questioning whether making a decision that way is a good way to make it. Whether that, and you gave an example of deciding which charity to give to based on their promotional materials. A picture of someone as opposed to looking at what work do they do and are they effective at doing it, that kind of thing.
Right. And I also felt like this was playing into some of the differences that we see in how much effort these government programs and even Google programs are trying to help women as opposed to men. And it's not that I have this innate affinity towards other men. I just am aware that humans in general have more sympathy towards women in general. And this is partly what causes there to be so many more government programs specifically for women, and so many problems that affect mostly men to be ignored. And that I felt was an important factor in discussing some of these diversity programs.
So if I'm understanding what you're saying, these concerns that you had about empathy, you felt were reflected generally in the population. Well, let me see if I can say this more clearly. So you were concerned about what you observe as society in general being more sympathetic towards women, or worried about how women are doing. And so there are many more government programs to try to support women. And you're worried that the problems of men are being ignored, and because they're just not focused on much.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah. And I felt like this was partly due to us simply having more sympathy towards women, which we can see in small scale experiments. And so
let me just reflect that back. So you're saying that your concern is that generally people have more sympathy for women, and that and because of that, that's why there are more programs and more help offered to women than to men.
Yeah, at least that's part of the explanation.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were being told to empathize or to increase our sympathy in these programs, and I felt like that would only increase our bias. And that was partly what I was trying to address, but I feel like the de-emphasize empathy was largely misunderstood by at least the media.
So when you wrote about de-emphasizing empathy, you were really saying that you were worried that people were overly sympathetic towards the feelings of women, and that was resulting in a lot of bias in programs and men's needs being ignored. And that's what you were trying to raise when you wrote about that in the memo. Is that right?
Right. I feel heard.
Okay. Thank you. Uh, okay, so I will speak. I'll speak to. Who will I speak to? I will speak to James. Well, let me see. Which one should I go? That's the problem with only three people. It kind of bounces back and forth in along axes. So I'll speak to James. Okay, so first off, let me restart the clock. Okay. First, I just want to say that I'm aware that we are three white males in this conversation talking about empathy and whatever, bias and diversity and so forth. And we don't have a lot of diversity in this circle. I just want to point that out, at least not gender diversity. We might have viewpoint diversity. So hearing your concerns about sympathy and the way maybe it's biased. So I kind of disagree with what you're saying about that there's more sympathy in society in general for women. I think historically, so maybe at the current moment, there's a lot of focus on women and, equality for women. And and when I say in the current moment, I mean maybe in the last 30 years, 40 years. But historically, women have had a very difficult time. And in many places in the world, they still have a very difficult time. Yeah. So, and why am I saying that?
I think James ought to reflect.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. You want to reflect, James?
Yeah. So you first just mentioned that we should be cognizant maybe of the fact that we don't necessarily have as much demographic diversity in our group, as three white men, and also you're saying that maybe my observations might be only pertinent to the last 30 years, but not historically when you're saying women had a harder time.
Right. And even today, in many places in the world, women are disadvantaged. And it's also, I think that I agree that the reasons for why, let's say, there's a gender gap in tech is complicated. It's not any one reason. Absolutely. And certainly the tech environment, places like Google, probably the people that are there are different than the general population. So I think also if you're trying to look at why is there a gender gap in tech or in tech at Google, that's a much narrower group to be making the question about or asking that question about. But one of the things, the leadership program that I teach in Sacramento, one of the things that I've learned from my 20 years of doing that is that, the way people grow up in their families, the culture of their families, and what they learn, the ways in which they learn to survive. So the adaptations that they make to survive in their families. So if they have a big family, if they have a very authoritarian family, if they have a family with alcohol in it, or if they have a family where there's a lot of dysfunction, and most families do have dysfunction of one kind or another, the kinds of things they learn from the adults in their family and the kinds of adaptations they make as children growing up result in an internal landscape, an emotional internal landscape that make behaving in certain ways difficult, so some of the aggressiveness or passiveness or various kinds of personality traits, many of which you write about. And I'm not a sociologist, so I don't have the data about this. The data that I do have is helping people explore what that inner landscape is and how it was formed and what their beliefs are and how they function inside those beliefs. and then, they could choose to do it differently if they want. And so I see that I think is a very big factor in how people behave and what results in their life.
Right. Yeah, so you started just elaborating on what I said in saying that in many places in the world, women seem to have it harder. And then you also said that, yes, there are many reasons why for the gender gap in tech. And the people in tech aren't really representative of the population. There is sort of a select group. And you've noticed in your leadership programs that you try to help people understand that how they were socialized creates some like mental landscapes that make certain behaviors basically that people are socialized to act certain ways, maybe, and that socialization has an effect on maybe how aggressive or passive people are.
Yes, thank you. And so I just want to say that, I started to say that the folks at Google who are in tech are maybe like a different sort of group of people. And what led me to say that other thing is actually inside people are all the same, even across cultures. The basic needs that people have for love, acceptance, meaning, respect, those are the same. But how people pursue those desires is different, and their personality traits, how the behaviors that they use to try to get them or the behaviors they have difficulty with are not the same. That's what's individual, based on what happens to people in their lives and kind of what they do with it.
Right. Yeah. So you're saying that everyone innately is the same, but that as socialization can change some of the personality traits, and like those personality traits are what I was talking about in the document.
I think that's right. Thank you. I feel fully heard for now. Thank you for listening to me so well. It was complicated what I was talking about.
Mm-hmm. I guess I'll talk to Edwin then.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important to really rethink about how we think about gender in some of these ways, and that we have to realize that people were really optimized for survival, and so men and women were given different roles, and to fulfill those roles, which are inherently different responsibilities, they were given different rights. And traditionally, men were the providers and protectors for the family, and women were the nurturers. And so I think we too often don't realize the difficulties put on men in that provider-protector role. And if we just look at the lower life expectancy, the higher number of men that are in prisons, the higher amount of men that die due to violence and in wars, and due to suicide, there are many difficulties that men face, even in the highly traditional societies today, that it's not very clear that women are worse off and men are the oppressors or anything like that. I think that there is this trade-off, and only one perspective is currently being heard.
Okay, so what I'm hearing there is that there were these traditional roles within society for the men and for women, and that there's sort of a focus on the experience of women, and the problems that men are having isn't really being addressed because there's high, I don't think you mentioned maybe homelessness, incarceration, violence, and so forth. So those concerns of men are not being addressed, and it's more the concerns of women are being addressed. And it's like you're wanting for all the different needs or experiences to be addressed instead of just one group. And
Right.
who is really being disadvantaged, like who's really having problems, and what are the levels of problems is kind of, you're kind of looking at that. Is it really so unbalanced, or is it really such difficulties in terms of benefits, or one side is getting more benefits and one isn't, and you're kind of looking at that, the nature of all that.
Right. And I think what is often portrayed is that men designed society to oppress women, when it was really society was designed to maximize survival. And to maximize survival, men and women were given different roles. And, men didn't necessarily have it easy in their role either. If
Oh,
they
okay.
weren't able to provide for their family, they would often be put in prison, or like they were literally slaves to their children, in that they have to work for them. And so, I mean, I'm not saying that men have it so bad and women have it so great, but just that our traditional or our current way of thinking about it is a little too skewed. And I think feminism currently is mainly from the female perspective, and the male perspective is being largely silenced and demonized.
Okay, so you're saying that feminism is silencing and demonizing the men's perspective, and they're seeing it as that there's sort of this patriarchy, and the society was designed for that, instead of seeing that the society was designed for roles, and in those roles, men suffered and had difficulties as well.
Right. And I mean, just some clear examples of, if it truly was that men designed society to oppress women, then it would be women that were in the draft, and it would be women that paid for dates, and women that had to be firefighters and police and all these dangerous jobs. But if you look at it more as society was created to maximize survival, it's clear why men were seen as disposable, because men are sort of biologically disposable, in that you only need one man to impregnate all the women, basically. So you can sacrifice the men in war as long as you still have some, but your population growth is limited by the number of fertile women that you have.
Mm-hmm. So am I hearing that you're wanting, underneath this, that you're wanting the needs of both men and women to be seen, and the needs of men aren't being seen? Is that kind of the essence of the need, the desire, the need? You would like really to create an environment where men's needs and experiences is seen as well, and that you're seeing that is not happening.
Right.
And you're kind of like having different arguments about, that setup, how that setup came about, and yeah. So is that kind of the?
Yeah,
Okay.
I feel hurt.
Okay. Well, then I'll speak back to you, James. Then, so I'm trying to bring this around to empathy, because I'm kind of obsessed with this topic. So it's like, what is the relationship? What is the role of empathy in this dynamic? And so for me, the way to address the needs of both men and women is for us to empathize with each other, to really hear what our needs even are. So not have these judgments and have these, maybe these different schemes or whatever, but to really hear what is your experience as a male? What is your experience in life? What is your felt experience in life? But for women as well, what is your experience? And that we have like a shared dialogue to be able to hear everyone's experience, as well as their hopes and desires and values and needs underneath that. I mean, equally. So.
Yeah, so you're trying to bring this back to empathy and trying to encourage everyone to hear both the female perspective and their thoughts and feelings, and also the male perspective.
Yeah, and so that's for me where the empathy comes in. Is for me, empathy is doing actually what we're doing right now. I mean, there's different definitions, and if you look at any of the literature, the definitions they the academic papers start, well, the definitions are kind of all over the place. You need to define your terms to begin with. So for me, there's a lot of different levels of empathy, but the first part is just to hear and feel into the experience of someone else. So which is what you're actually doing to me now. You're listening to me and you're kind of feeling into what my experience is. So we're sort of, doing it right now.
Yeah, so you're saying that there are maybe multiple definitions and layers of empathy, but the core one that you tried to emphasize is just hearing and feeling into another person's experience and perspective.
Yeah, and their feelings. What is they feeling? What is what is the hurt? What is the not just the hurt, but what is the joy? What is the full spectrum of their experience, and hearing that and kind of being open to feel into that.
Yeah, so being able to feel into the entire experience, so their emotion too.
And some of the definitions that come up, like I think maybe your work, some of your criticisms of empathy or so were based on Paul Bloom's work, where his definition of empathy, and I've talked to him via chat. He won't do a recorded dialogue with me. I've tried for 4 years. I said, Paul, let's have an empathy circle. The very first paper he came out with in the New Yorker, I said, Paul, let's have an empathy circle. And he says he has no time. And so I've been trying for 4 years to talk to him about that. So that's the first thing so his definition, though, of empathy, and I could never understand this for a long time, but it's basically that if I come and I'm all aggravated, it's like, oh, I'm so angry, I'm so pissed off, I'm just in this rage. That for him, empathy is that, as you're listening to me, that you jump up and down and say, oh, I'm all in a rage, I'm all upset. And we're both sitting there jumping up and down in this rage. And he's saying that that's what empathy is. So maybe if you want to just reflect that.
Yeah, so you're sort of disappointed in that you feel like maybe I was using Paul Bloom's definition, and you've been trying to get him to do an empathy circle with you, but you haven't succeeded in that. And you think that his definition of empathy is that if one person is really mad, then the other person will also feel that same anger.
Yeah, it's sort of that mirroring, taking it on. He gives the example of going to his therapist and that happening. So he says it himself. So it's very different. In fact, for me, that would be more of a sympathetic response or a mirroring of there's terms like emotional contagion and so forth for, kind of taking on someone else's feelings and why that happens, but there'd be a lot of different reasons for it. But for me, the definition of empathy is for you to be being here, doing what you're doing, is listening to me and feeling into my experience. So if I have anger with Paul Bloom, say, that guy, he just will not talk, and I'm pissed off with him. It's like, you don't jump up and down in anger either. You say, well, tell me more about, I'm hearing you're upset with Paul Bloom. And so you're feeling into my experience, my feelings about it, and kind of what's behind it. So, it's kind of exploring my experience of empathy. So feeling into my experience. And that's kind of the first core piece of empathy is that experience. And there's plenty of people that, in the therapeutic world, like Carl Rogers, who really used this process, and I'd sent you a link about him, that he had really articulated this process and defined empathy. And Paul Bloom doesn't even mention him. He's a top clinical psychologist, one of the top 6 psychologists, in the world, and Paul Bloom doesn't even mention that. So that's more of my frustration with Paul. So yeah.
Yeah, so you feel that his definition of empathy is more this sympathetic mirroring uh, response, but a closer or more functional definition would be, feeling into someone's experience and really hearing them, and you feel like this has been explored by other therapists like Carl Rogers,
Mm-hmm.
and he's seems to be a really prominent person in this field, but Paul Bloom doesn't even acknowledge this perspective, and so that's creating some frustration.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, I feel heard. My time's up too.
Okay. I guess I'll talk to Lou. So I guess I definitely acknowledge that socialization has an effect on people, and expecting gender roles, or like strict adherence to gender roles, is likely a negative for people. And I don't want to be held up to the pure masculine gender role, right? And but I think it may be doing a disservice to people to say that hormones and testosterone, for example, don't have any effect on people, and that the difference in aggression that men have is all due to socialization, because that would actually put so much onus on the parents and say, oh, your son grew up to be a criminal, therefore you were horrible parents maybe, or they had horrible kids, when really, like, men do have a lot more testosterone, and that seems to be behind some of their increased aggression.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying that you do agree that socialization plays a role in how people behave and how they think and how they are, but that you feel that biology also plays a role that should not be ignored, and that it's not correct, and it's kind of also not effective. It doesn't really work well to ignore that there are biological factors, like, for instance, men have more testosterone generally than women, and that's linked to aggressiveness.
Right. And so I feel like there is this urge to believe that everyone is at the core the same, and then we can mold people to be however we want, and that would create this utopia. But that also has its disadvantages. So it does put the onus on parents and stuff when their child doesn't end up being great in some ways, and sometimes that's not entirely their fault. And so I feel like insisting everything is nurture also makes people that fit the traditional gender roles feel guilty sometimes too, where feminism seems to make women that just want to be stay-at-home moms, for example, they feel guilty.
So you're saying now that that some of the downsides of emphasizing the nurture portion of how people turn out, emphasizing that too much, puts a lot of pressure on parents. If your child turns out a certain way, the parents feeling responsible for that, and people blaming parents for the way their children turn out. And it also puts pressure on the socialization aspect, puts pressure on women who, let's say, want to play more of a stereotypical female role, like, for instance, deciding to be a stay-at-home mom and not work, and that they feel social pressure not to do that because of others who who take the point of view everyone should be equal, and they're trying to create some kind of utopian society where everybody is equal.
Mm-hmm. And I guess I've been talking about parents, but peer groups have actually been, it seems like peer groups have the largest influence on your upbringing, more than your parents actually. And one toy example is just your accent. It seems if you're, for example, a first generation immigrant and you have kids, they will end up having an American accent rather than whatever accent you seem to have. And so I think, yes, like we should at least acknowledge that where the socialization often happens. So making sure that your kid has good friends in some ways, I think is important.
So you're saying that research, I assume you're citing some kind of research, that research shows that your peer group actually has more influence on you than your parents. And an example of that is, that children of immigrant families wind up with accents like their peer group, not like their parents. And that because the timer went off, I forgot the last point that you made. Was there another point?
Well, just that it's important to have good friends, and that may be the best thing that you can do as a parent.
Yes, and so because your peer group has a bigger influence than your parents, that it's actually more important for parents to make sure that you have good friends and when you're growing up.
Yeah, I feel heard.
Okay, great. So I'll talk to Edwin. So I think in terms of empathy, so I think of empathy as being able to see and hear and kind of understand, reflect back the basic human needs that you're seeing in a person when they're expressing themselves and the feelings that they're having. And I think my experience, and I believe research bears this out too, but my experience is the way in which we are all the same is that we all have the same kind of feelings. So we all feel grief, we all feel joy, we all feel anger, we all feel sadness. Those are the 4 basic emotions. You can get lots of other words to those. And we all have the same basic feelings, regardless of culture or gender or other ethnicity, race, whatever. And we all have the same basic needs, like the need for respect, the need for connection, the need for love, the need for meaning, a need for spirituality, a need for, by spirituality, I just mean a connection to something larger than yourself. And I need to play, I need to have fun, I need to learn, learn and grow, a need for freedom, freedom of choice, like to know that you have some freedom of choice. And that's not an exhaustive list, but it is, those are some of the basic human needs that people in all cultures experience them. What's different about people is the way in which they pursue those basic human needs. So let's say the need for safety. Everyone has a need for safety. So an aggressive male might pursue their need for safety by, buying a gun or building up their muscles so that they can fight if they need to. And the way someone who's less powerful, whether that's a man or a woman, physically powerful, they might pursue safety, would be to know the people around them, like go and have conversations with them, connect with people so that they feel a sense of safety because they understand what's going on around them. And by creating connection, they reduce the likelihood that someone's going to harm them because they know people. Those are 2 strategies, and those aren't the only 2 strategies. There's lots of different other strategies that might be used to create safety.
Maybe
I'll stop there.
Okay. Yeah. So what I'm hearing there is for you, empathy is feeling into the experience of others, to what they're experiencing and what their needs are, and you're seeing those feelings and those needs as being universal. and that there's universal needs like safety and respect, and that everyone has those, but that those needs for like safety, people try to address those needs differently. Like one person might use, wanting to protect, get a gun or whatever to kind of protect themselves. And then someone else would be strong, build up their muscles for protection. And yet someone else might use trying to create connection and understanding and dialogue for creating that sense of safety. So and those are basically underlying, just universal qualities that people have in all cultures, basically.
Thank you. Yes. And so, so I think the differences, the different ways that people pursue their basic human needs, that creates culture, that creates different cultures, whether that's, ethnic culture or gender differences. And I believe there's probably some biology that's part of that. And I don't know what percentage is biology and what percentage is social or constructed. And I tend to think that a larger portion of it is constructed, certainly in my own life experience. I've seen that. So, so I think, the way in which things should be the same. So the way equality should be approached would be to try to create, let's say with respect, that everyone should be treated with respect. Now, what respect means to different people, how they pursue respect or how they experience being respected would be different. And that's where empathy comes in, because you want to try to understand what's important to someone, what means respect to them. So like in some cultures, looking someone in the eye when you speak to them, that is an expression of respect. In other cultures, if you look them in the eye, looking away is a sign of respect. In another culture, looking away is a sign of weakness, or a sign of deference.
So what I'm hearing is different cultures are addressing these needs differently and have different ways of addressing it. And for you, empathy is to see those expressions that people have of how they're trying to address those needs, and to see how those needs, those expressions connect back to the underlying common human needs or values and feelings.
Yes, thank you. And so, I'm make sure I started the timer. Did I start the timer? I didn't. Okay. This is a problem. My own speaking terms, I sometimes forget to start the timer. Okay, I'll just say, let's see, when do I have more I want to say? Well, and so I think one of the dangers of programs, whether they're government or company programs, one of the dangers is of a one-size-fits-all program is that, not everyone is going to, needs are going to be met by one thing. And so that's why listening and dialogue and flexibility. And so I think programs to try to address needs are a good idea. And I think but I think they have to be, I don't know. I'm less clear about. Well, I'm not thinking of something specific, so I'm not able to make a clear statement about what I think, like the programs at Google or how that applies. Well, I'm not sure. I need to think some more about how what I'm saying applies, let's say, in a work environment. Certainly when I was a manager, I tried to listen to my employees and recognize that showing respect for each of them was not the same thing. In other words, I did different things because each of them would receive respect in a different way.
Okay, so in terms of addressing people's needs, you're seeing that as a good thing, and that having a program that tries to address those needs, but a program might not address all the different ways that people get that need addressed. So it's the listening and the dialogue is and kind of an open flexibility is important to have, to be sensitive to where people are. And then even like with respect, one person might feel respect in one way, but yet another person might feel respect in another way. And so you need the certain sensitivity there. And maybe even the empathy is part of that. That sensitivity is the empathy, like, oh, I'm hearing this for you and this for you. And that's kind of where the empathy comes in, is to hear that and the meanings this has for people.
Thank you. I feel heard.
Okay. I'll speak to James then. And so for me, I had sort of a request here actually in this circle, and it's to have a modification of your memo. So the request is to modify the memo to emphasize empathy. So right now it says de-emphasize empathy, and so I'm kind of like putting in a request. What about having a change to it and actually say, oh, I learned something about empathy. It's not quite what I thought, and I see that empathy is actually beneficial, and something along those lines. So that's kind of like a request I'm putting in there.
So yeah, you had a request or mission maybe for this dialogue to have me change maybe the memo from de-emphasize empathy to emphasize empathy. And for me to show that I have really taken in feedback and realized that maybe I had some misunderstandings about empathy.
Yeah, and then the other part is we're going forward with these dialogues, and the next dialogue was going to be with a variety of participants. We've been looking at women who have written about some of these feminist issues, and there's also a conservative group that I saw a CNN program about, and I wanted to contact the organizers of that group and for Silicon Valley, maybe some journalists. But do we have a larger circle to bring in some more voices, and actually have an empathy circle to bring in those voices and keep this dialogue going? Is kind of like the next request.
Mm-hmm. So your next request would be to really bring more people into the dialogue, for example, feminists and also conservatives in Silicon Valley.
Yep, I feel heard.
I guess I'll talk back to you then.
Okay.
I definitely think that I was likely using the wrong definition of empathy. And, in our offline conversations, it seems like what I should have said was sympathy, maybe, at least. And I still think that, one-on-one sympathy is good, probably, at least it has its functions. But, for these large-scale policies, it is useful to really look at the statistics and facts rather than anecdotes.
Okay, so I'm hearing that perhaps you're seeing that you had misused the word or used it in a different way, and that the sympathy, that you do see that there might be some problems with sympathy, but you're saying sympathy is perhaps good in person-to-person smaller relationships, maybe two people or so, but that it's not good for larger policy decisions. Having just a story here, one story, and making a whole policy out of that is not an effective way of making larger scale policy.
Right. And I guess also going back to the empathizing versus systemizing, I still think, though, that systemizing is important for computer programming. So that is trying to understand a system and really look at the underlying rules that govern that system. That, in my mind, is very important for computer programming, and really working through the logic of a long program and seeing how different systems interact. So in that way, I still think that we would expect to see high systemizers in computer programming.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying in terms of the systemizing and empathizing model that there is still that systematizing, that there are systematizers who like to go through these systems and really understand them and develop it. So that's your understanding there still, you feel that still holds between the two. And
I mean, that's not to say that empathizing is bad or isn't necessary, just that systemizing seems to be necessary, or at least is an advantage for computer programmers.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so having a systematizing mindset is advantageous for programmers, and so you're just that's just something you see.
Yeah, and I guess one small thing is this is more for like back-end server code and not so much when you're trying to develop a program that will be directly used by a user.
Mm-hmm. So you're seeing that the systematizing is really important in the back-end code where you're not dealing with directly with users.
All right, yeah, I feel heard.
Okay. I'll speak back to you, and yeah, in terms of the systematizing, like I think you're saying that, I mean, this is based on the work of Simon Baron-Cohen. You know, he's written about it, and he's actually a real proponent of empathy. He says we need more empathy in the world. And he's trying to describe these different states of mind, and there's being very systematic in your mindset versus being very and enjoying it. You know, it's like there's real feelings of joy and creativity, and then even sharing your ideas, and you find a new solution to a problem. There's a lot of feeling that comes up, satisfaction that comes from that kind of work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as you're mentioning that Simon Baron-Cohen has worked a lot on this, and he tries to increase the amount of empathy we have in the world. And I guess just going back to systemizing, you mentioned that systemizers really do enjoy systemizing, and it may sound cold, but there is a lot of emotion there.
Yeah, and having been a systematizer in high tech, I enjoy computer networks, how they work, getting into the system and making it work. So there's there was a lot of pleasure, and I still enjoy that. It's not the really super deep work that you're talking about, way in the bowels of a program where you're just dealing with logarithms and so forth. But there's still relationships with fellow systematizers that can be very satisfying. So there's even a empathic connection, with the other systematizers. You're saying, oh, I had this great idea. It's like, oh, I get you're really excited about this creative idea that you had. So there is sort of this empathic relationship among systematizers as well.
Right. So, and you mentioned that you're working at Xerox PARC, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you have a lot of experience being a systemizer, and you found it very pleasurable. And but I guess you want to emphasize too that there's a lot empathizing between systemizers, and I guess because they have such a similar mindset, it's easy for them to understand why one would like that same experience.
And it might be good for some of the systematizers to get together in empathy circles with empathizers to bring the two together to really dialogue and hear each other. And because I think that the systematizers can grow in their empathy, because if you look at those charts of systematizers and empathizers, male and female, they're not that big. There's not this huge difference. There's like small. I mean, it's not a huge difference unless you have something like autism or, some of these other highly systematizing, states of mind.
Mm-hmm. And so you find that there might be value in getting systemizers to talk with empathizers and maybe increase their empathy. And you also see that maybe some of the differences are overblown because there is still a lot of overlap.
Yeah.
And except for some of the extreme cases like autism.
Yeah, and I still would like to see if we can do a addendum, an empathic addendum. I'm going to keep pushing for that.
Yeah, so you're pushing for an addendum of my document for
requesting. It's a request and a pushing. Yeah, so I feel heard. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. I guess, Lou, do you want to talk? I feel like I've been talking a lot.
So you're, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're feeling talked out, or are you more worried that I'm feeling left out? I guess you said you're feeling talked out.
Yeah, a little of both, I guess. I guess one thing that I'll just say, which building on Edwin's, or two, yeah, I'll definitely have to think about an addendum. People have requested, me to do a updated document, and so I would have to take into multiple things in that, and I would probably do this empathy thing. And two, you mentioned increasing people's empathy, and that's something I'm personally interested in. It's like, how much can you shift or increase your empathy?
So you are thinking about maybe doing a revision of your memo because you've gotten a lot of requests for that. Sorry, I did not restart the clock. And you are interested in this idea that of can people increase the amount of empathy that they have for others, and you're interested in that kind of examining that. Did you say that you're interested in increasing your own empathy too, or just that you were interested in finding out if that's actually possible, if people can do that?
Both, for sure. So, I guess some disclosure, I'm actually on the autism spectrum. So I'm a high systemizer, low empathizer. And so I still feel like I do want to understand other people's perspective, but maybe I don't really read facial cues as well, for example. And so some social things I'm not as skilled at.
So if I'm hearing you right, you're interested in both increasing your own ability to empathize and studying whether that's possible, because you are on the autism spectrum, you're a high systematizer, low empathizer, and you sometimes have difficulty reading facial cues, or you're aware that you have trouble reading facial cues in people.
Right. Yeah, I feel her.
Okay. I'm just searching for what I want to talk about. So I'll talk to Edwin. So I think, one thing that's important, I think, is that empathy can be expressed in a lot of different ways. So words is one way. Just the way you look at someone. So empathy can be expressed silently, just by the way that you are looking at someone. If the internal process that's going on in me is that I am paying full attention to someone, and that I am focused on what are they feeling and why is this important to them. So I'm focused on the meaning of what they're saying and why it's important to them and their emotions. That is an empathic stance. And that is felt by the person. That is likely to be felt by the person, whether I say something or not. I can also do nonverbal things that express a desire, connection, or empathy for the other person. That might be putting a hand on their shoulder, or giving them a hug, or moving closer to them, or just tilting my body. So, body language is part of it also. So I just want to say that empathy can be expressed in a lot of different ways, not only through words.
So you're wanting to express that empathy is expressed in a lot of different ways. It's not just by using words, but it's the way we see someone. It's the way we put a hand on their shoulder, our state of awareness with being with them. And it's very multifaceted how we do empathy, how we empathize. Yeah.
Yeah, and it also, and because I don't want to promote the idea that, empathy is expressed these specific ways. So I just mentioned a bunch of behaviors that can be received as empathy, but actually it's my internal stance that I think is most important. So when I'm listening to someone, I am evaluating whether what they're saying is right or wrong, or accurate or inaccurate, or I agree with it or I don't agree with it, or it's to this or to that. In other words, if I'm in an evaluative mode, then I am not really being empathic. Empathy means stepping out of right-wrong thinking and evaluating, judging what the person is saying. And really, so it is a form of evaluation. I'm evaluating, what do I think they're thinking, and why is this important to them? So it's not like I'm turning my brain off and I'm not thinking at all, but I'm focused on something different than, is what they're saying correct or incorrect? Is it morally right or morally wrong? Do I agree with it or I disagree with it? And I'm focused on just understanding it fully, receiving it, and their feelings around it, and then reflecting that back. And that stance is an empathic stance. And whatever behavior I do when I'm in that stance, whether that's just listening silently, or I move to some kind of behavior, the fact that it comes out of that stance is more significant. Is the most significant thing.
So for you, it's about an empathic stance. It's sort of an internal way of being, where you're being sensitive to the feelings and of the other person, instead of when someone responds, that you're like evaluating it or judging it or kind of criticizing it. And so that would not be an empathic stance. The empathic stance is being sort of open and aware of where the other person is, and it can be with words or not with words. It's more of a way of being, an openness and a way of being, and a sensitivity to the other person. And it's important for you that be kind of conveyed, that's really for you what empathy is.
Yes, thank you. And the importance of, and I think people talk about, well, Barack Obama said, we have an empathy deficit in the United States. And I see that a lot too. A lot of our culture is very focused on right, wrong thinking, agree, disagree, right, wrong, blaming, and I think that does not create connection. It does not create understanding. And it doesn't help people enter shared problem solving. So what's powerful about empathy is that if you were having a conflict and I really understand you, I get to a place of really understanding you and feel like you really understand me, we're going to be able to enter shared problem solving a lot more easily than if we don't, than if we're busy judging each other and we don't really understand each other, and we don't feel understood by each other.
So with empathy, it's a state, an inner state of being, and that, for example, if there's a conflict, if we can really hear each other and empathize with each other and get down to what are the feelings and the needs that that each person has, that it's more easy to kind of find what the real solution is and then to address it, versus if we're kind of more into our evaluations and judgments about each other. So it's really coming down to the kind of getting down underneath and getting deeper to these deeper felt experience and needs that people have, that we each have, and for problem solving and fostering connection.
Yes, thank you. And I have one more point that I want to make, which is about pain. So often the reason people have conflict is because they're both in a lot of pain and they both need to express what's going on and be understood for it. And neither person is in a place where they can listen to the other person. So when James writes in his memo under de-emphasizing empathy, I've heard several calls for increased empathy on diversity issues. What that means to me is that since increased empathy on diversity issues means showing some understanding for the pain that people in disadvantaged groups have experienced. And I'm guessing that the pain that James was experiencing was the pain also of not being heard and understood for what he was experiencing. And that's when you have the most conflict, is when neither person, and I guess in some ways, diversity warriors feel like the pain that they've been feeling has been going on for a very long time. So they've been waiting for a very long time to be understood for what's happening for them. And they don't want to listen to whatever current discomfort, privileged white males are having, because they want to be understood for what's happening for them. And I'm not arguing that that's justified, but that is why the pain is so large, and that is why there's so much energy about wanting to be understood and heard, and why there's so much conflict, because there is pain on both sides, and people have difficulty. When people are in pain, they have difficulty listening.
So you're really looking at
a lot they want to express.
Yeah, so you're really looking at the nature of pain, that when you have two sides, multiple sides that are in pain, it's really hard for them to hear each other. And because underneath that pain is a real desire to express themselves and to be heard. And that maybe inhibits being ready and open to hearing other people's pain. And what you're seeing about perhaps diversity activists is that those groups have had a great deal of pain for a long time. So they're like tired of waiting to be heard about their pain. So they're like, I don't want to listen to your pain. I want my pain to be heard now. And so you're just kind of looking at the nature of pain and how it works in these different, in maybe inhibiting connection and so forth. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I feel heard.
Okay. Yeah, it's. I'll speak back to you, Lou. So another aspect of empathy is what I would call imaginative empathy. And this sort of addresses the pain, is that there's the empathy that we're doing of feeling into each other's experience as we're doing in the circle. There's also kind of a role taking and a sort of an imaginative empathy, where we can actually take on the role. Like we could do some role playing here, that we could all be diversity warriors or women, and then dialogue from that role. So that's like another aspect of empathy that I wanted to kind of address.
So you're saying another aspect of empathy is what you're calling imaginative empathy, and that's where you understand the feelings and experience of another person by actually like role playing them, using your imagination to step into their perspective and to speak or do other kinds of role playing behavior that expresses their reality.
Yeah. So if they're
the understanding that comes from
that. So we could take on the role. We could have James take on the role of a feminist and like argue from that point of view. And just know that we could just take the role. I'm just giving an example of how this works. And then this is an ardent feminist, been fired from tech. Like, what does it feel like to be that person? And then to argue in this group of men or something about your position. So that's like I'm saying, what I'd call imaginative empathy, and it's kind of like another layer. Another aspect, another facet of empathy.
So you just gave an example of a kind of imaginative empathy role play where a person takes on the role of a person that they want to understand their perspective, like a feminist tech worker that got fired, and you role play that as a way of understanding them. That would be an example of how to use imaginative empathy.
And then in that case, you feel into, I'm a feminist, and what's my felt experience? You know, what am I feeling here? It's like, I'm like tired of being treated this way. You know, I want to be heard. You know, so it's just feeling into the role, and, you know, like actors are masters at it, you know, Meryl Streep, etc. They can just step into that and almost become the person. And then, so that's another aspect of empathy, which is very rich and maybe a bit more, advanced.
So right, you explained it more because you're wanting us to understand more fully what this would be, where you actually, you know, you take on the thinking and the emotional state of the person, and you feel it fully, you experience it, and that informs you in a way that, you know, and that you gave an example, you know, actors are masters at this, and it has the same kind of, it can have, it can deepen a person's understanding by doing that.
Yeah, and then there's another facet of this is the self-empathy, is really feeling into my own experience. So what am I, you know, feeling like right now at this moment? I feel a little bit of a, you know, constriction in my body, kind of up here. I also feel some sort of a spaciousness in this, you know, talking in the group. So I'm feeling into that, and I'm feeling like a little concern about time, you know. So I'm feeling into my own experience, a little bit of a worry. How are we doing on time? How does everyone feel about time? So I'm feeling into my own experience, and I would call that self-empathy. So this is just for, you know, putting some labels on different experiences.
So another aspect of empathy is self-empathy, which has to do with looking inside and being aware of what's going on in you, the thoughts and the feelings that you're having. And you described some of the ones that you were having at the moment, like being concerned about time, but also a certain kind of spaciousness. So you use words to describe how you're feeling and what you're aware of in terms of your internal landscape. And so you just were wanting people to understand that that's another form of empathy, is this self-empathy.
Yeah.
And
that was the essence of it. That was, thank you.
Okay.
Okay,
So I'll talk to James. And I think that just tagging on the idea of the value of self-empathy. So the value of it is that when I'm aware, well, first off, if I'm not getting the empathy that I need from someone else, I can give it to myself by being aware. So if I'm in a conversation and I'm listening and I'm starting to get anxious or I'm starting to get upset, I can breathe. I can kind of look inside and notice, oh, this is happening. You know, oh, my need for whatever, fairness is not being met, or my need for, or I'm scared, I'm getting scared now that I'm going to get attacked or something like that. Having an awareness of, so my need for safety then is really what would be up. Having that awareness helps me track what's going on and maybe do something to help calm myself, like breathe, or interrupt the person, maybe stop the conversation, say, you know, right now I'd like to hear what you have to say, but right now I can't really listen to you. I'm feeling I need a break, and can we take a break, or make some other kind of request to take care of myself so that I could participate in the conversation the way I want to, rather than like getting all upset and not freezing, not knowing what to say, or saying something that I regret later.
Mm-hmm. So you're describing the value of self-empathy, and it seems to be that being self-aware and more in tune with your own experience lets you, even if other people may not be in tune with your experience, it lets you have that awareness, and which gives you, the power to say, oh, maybe I'm feeling uncomfortable, or like, what's the underlying reason behind that? And it lets you, shift or just express what you're feeling to others. And, that's generally good for your life and in interactions.
Yeah, yes, or it helps me with the awareness. I can use that awareness to express what's going on in me to others, or I may choose not to. I just may use it to manage myself, like do some kind of internal tools or other external tools to help manage myself.
Yeah, so it wouldn't only be to help in interactions, but also just you can use it internally to manage your own emotions and feelings.
Yes. Okay. What more do I want to talk about? Something that was interesting in your memo was about how to correct for past inequities. And I think you wrote that it was not fair to have programs that preference one group over another as a way to make up for past inequities. I think that's one of the things you said. And so I was curious about that. How do you make up for past inequities if you don't do something like that? So if there has been a historical thing of people being treated unfairly, or having one group having an unfair advantage over another, how do you make up for that without having programs that address that specific group or try to make up for that? So I'm sorry, go ahead and reflect that back.
You saw that I felt like programs just for a particular group that may have been historically disadvantaged, that I said those programs are unfair, and you're curious what it is that we could do to try to correct for these past injustices.
Thank you. And then the second piece was about So let me see if I can get that thread back. Darn. It was about diversity. So the value of diversity. So if you believe, which it sounds like you from the memo, you do think that diversity is a very good attribute. If the goal is to create more diversity, because maybe science and experience show that diversity is a good thing in terms of robust, rich problem solving, and so if you want diversity and you don't have diversity, you're not getting diversity, either because of historical things or cultural, the way the culture is in the group or the business, then if you want diversity, then maybe you do have to do preferential things in order to attract the diverse population, so that you have diversity, and that diversity then has an impact on the culture of creating more of a culture that is going to attract a diverse group. So,
so saying that if the company does want the diversity and the potential benefits that come from that, that maybe they need to, select people from diverse groups, and so that would require some of these programs and preferential hiring of certain groups, and that may have a positive feedback that would encourage further diversity.
Yes, thank you. I feel heard.
All right. I guess I'll talk to you then to address those.
Okay.
So as for addressing past injustices, I think it can be really hard, especially because history is so politicized. I was talking about how it's not very clear that necessarily women were oppressed because men were also oppressed. And in hunter-gatherer societies, 30% of men would die from violence. And so that also seems like a pretty bad experience. And it's not clear that people coming out of college were necessarily facing the same, like correcting for workplace discrimination in the past by doing preferential treatment of college age applicants doesn't seem right to me.
So you're saying that when it comes so on the topic of historical discrimination, that there are lots of versions of history or lots of ways of interpreting history, and it's not necessarily clear to you that that there has been a lot of oppression or discrimination in the past, and you cited how lots of men die in fulfilling their role in the society as men, that they go off to fight and they get killed. Is that a form of oppression? And you think things today, let's say for college educated people coming out of college, are they really disadvantaged? It sounds like you're questioning, are they really disadvantaged? And so do they really need some kind of preferential treatment? Is that right?
Right. Yeah. So I would definitely not deny that there was workplace discrimination, like very rampant workplace discrimination in the past. And I think focusing solely on past problems can blind us to current problems. And I guess to go back to your second point, so how would we increase the diversity of a company if not by preferential hiring? And I think one would be, I think diversity is useless if there's no inclusion and there's no empathy and trying to really understand people's perspective. And so first we have to increase the inclusion and empathy of the company, and then diversity would naturally come on board, because in a company without that, then it's just a horrible experience for those in the minority. And I guess for you to echo that.
Okay, so let's see. So let's see, your second point, which is most present in my mind, so I'll say that. So your second point was that if you want more diversity in the workplace, then a good strategy for that would be to create more inclusiveness and acceptance, and that you think that diversity would naturally occur as a result of that, and that if you do what you perceive is going on now, which is create a preferential program, then really you're just disadvantaging a new minority. So you're taking whatever minority happens to be in that culture. You're just creating another cycle of oppression where whatever the minority happens to be in that culture gets discriminated against. Right? Is that what you're saying?
Well, so I'm saying in a non-inclusive environment, minorities naturally will feel like they're excluded because their experience isn't as well understood by the majority of people. And
Right.
so, increasing inclusiveness is really important in general. And I think we also too often emphasize just demographic diversity and not viewpoint or any other type of diversity, which, the demographic diversity seems to be a proxy for viewpoint diversity, but we never actually measure or care about that as itself. And that can be seen clearly with the lack of political and religious diversity at Google. So nearly everyone is an atheist and nearly everyone is on the left.
So, so you're saying, if I hearing you right, you're saying inclusivity is the most important thing, because what's important is for everyone to feel welcomed and a part of, and that they're and accepted. And because if you don't have that, then whatever the more minority is in a given culture, they will feel left out or discriminated against. And in Google, it happens to be, if it's majority left, then it will be the conservatives that feel that way. Is that right?
Right.
Okay. And then you made a second point, which was about, boy, it's interesting that I'm having trouble hanging on to these points. What was the second point that you made?
Just that we concentrate too much on demographic diversity rather than
not viewpoint diversity, right? So using demographic diversity as a proxy, you said, for viewpoint diversity, and that actually it's viewpoint diversity that's more important, because it's not, and that the Google's not really measuring that. You'd like to see them measure that because you think that's more important.
Right, and it's actually stereotyping people and saying all women think a different way than all men, basically.
Right.
But I feel heard.
Okay.
Okay, so we're coming up to the 2-hour slot, which I had set. So maybe we could end here and just go around, like, how was this, or unless there's somebody that really is dying to speak, or we could do a follow-up in that case as well. I would say one thing I'm really enjoying. Was there anything else, Lou? I just saw a look on your face.
Well, yeah, thank you. So it's interesting because we are this last little bit, we were into some of the specifics of things that James wrote in his memo, and it's very interesting. I don't often have trouble tracking what people are saying and feeding it back to them. And then the last couple of exchanges that James and I did, I actually lost one of his points. Like, he said 2 points, and I lost one of them 2 times. And I think it's because I was disagreeing with some of what he was saying, and it was hard for me to hold it. So that's just an interesting thing. Or it's not so much that I disagreed. I had things I wanted to say. I had responses that I wanted to say, and it was hard for me to set that aside. Mm-hmm. I think. I think the phase of the conversation we're in now is an interesting phase, and it would be interesting to continue a little bit longer.
Okay, I can do it. I can do it. I don't know.
Do you, James?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Put another half hour on the clock or so.
Well, no, I'm not saying a half hour.
Okay.
I can go another half hour. I guess I felt like we were stopping at a point where it was, I don't know, what do I want to say?
Okay, so we'll go for a bit. Just say when you feel kind of like we've hit that point then.
Okay. So I guess what I want to talk about, and who I'll talk to Edwin
Okay.
So I guess what I want to talk about is, again, I guess going back to the idea of historical diversity. So, and I'm talking about this as a white, heterosexual male. So I am Jewish, and I don't think I've experienced significant discrimination in my life because I'm Jewish. Although some people have told me that I have. That's not how I chose to interpret some experiences I had where I got, I didn't get things that I wanted. Some people said it was because I was Jewish. I didn't believe that. But so it's kind of weird, actually, for me to be saying, to be talking about historical racism or historical sexism, because it's not like I experienced it myself. But I think that so I agree with what James is saying, that inclusion is the most important value, and that we should, that what's best for everyone is to include all points of view and to have empathy for all points of view and to try to understand all points of view. That's what creates safety. That's what creates a collaborative work environment. That's what creates inclusion. But I also think that it's important to try to recognize the effects of historical discrimination. So James said, yes, there was rampant sexism in the workplace in the past. And I think that the long-term ripple effects of cultural, racism, sexism in the culture it doesn't just disappear, just because I treat women with respect and listen to them, and I have a very egalitarian relationship with my wife, and the women that I interact with in my world. And when I was a manager, when I was director at CSU, I tried to do that. I'm sure I made mistakes. I'm sure I misunderstood people and maybe did things that they thought were disrespectful. And so I think it's very important to recognize that the history of that has consequences, and I think there does need to be correction for that. And I think, yeah.
Okay.
And I think that when a person, if you really understand the impact, the pain that people have gone through and the impact of that, then, I don't know what I'm saying. I'm not being very clear. I guess I am saying that I think things that happened in the past that do have impacts that come forward, and that it doesn't disappear just because people now, let's say, are behaving more fairly. There's some repair and some healing needs to happen, and some structural changes have to happen in order for the results of that disadvantage to be made up for. That's my opinion.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you say then is that you agree that inclusion and empathy in a culture is important to create that environment, which is what James was saying. So you agree there, and that you're seeing that people who have been disadvantaged through history to the present, that some sort of a repair needs to take place, even if things are sort of equal at the present. maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But it's like some sort of repair needs to take place for those past, that past lack of inclusion, or the pain that people feel bringing from the past. That there's a healing that's needed around for that.
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
I think so. I'm not sure. I mean, I've not studied it. I'm not a sociologist.
Mm-hmm.
So I haven't studied it, but I think so.
Yeah. So you're not sure of it from sort of a statistic sociology point of view, but just from your own feelings, it seems like there's a need for that sort of repair and healing.
Yes, and thank you. And you listening to me is actually helping me clarify. I'm getting a little bit clearer. So I also think that pursuing diversity is a good way to do that. So recognizing that different kinds of people bring different life experience and different perspectives and different so I do, and so I do think that choosing people, and you could say this is a preference thing, and I think I did this in my own work, where I wanted diversity. I valued diversity, and I wanted diversity in staff. And so when I was hiring, that is something I would look at, and I wouldn't hire someone that wasn't qualified to do a job. But all other things being equal, having diversity, really, I thought was a very positive thing.
Mm-hmm. So you were saying, as a manager yourself, you're saying that diversity is positive and a good thing, and you tried to create that. And it sounds like you also see that as one way to addressing the past or ongoing pain too, that is there. So it's one way to address it.
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I feel heard.
Okay. I'll speak to James. And so when I heard you speaking about the culture to create, I heard inclusion and I heard the word empathy, and my eyes lit up. And you mentioned it 2 or even 3 times. I said, yes. That is and that's what I would call it, is a culture of empathy. So how do we start from the present to create a more empathic culture where everyone feels included and everyone feels heard in the present? So I think that's what you were saying, and that's what I am advocating for, is that if we have a microcosm of a business or a family, it's like, can we create an empathic culture now, and can we work on that and build and design and foster that and learn about it and grow in that in the present?
So you heard me say pushing for a more inclusive and culture, and one with more empathy, and you got really excited, and you feel like your push for a culture of empathy is very much in line with what I'm saying, and it would really help people feel more included and feel heard.
Yeah, so it's creating that culture, and then and one thing is, it's time consuming. Like here we've been going for about 2 hours, and it's taken us about 2 hours to start getting to some finer points. And empathy to begin with is very time consuming. With everybody rush, don't have time. It takes a lot of time to have these dialogues and kind of really create this mutual understanding. And there's also like a trust gets built, right? I feel more trustful that going forward I'll be heard by both you and Lou. And so it's a time consuming initially, at least to begin with. It's very time consuming.
So you're saying culture of empathy can be time consuming, but there are some advantages of you definitely get heard and you help build trust between people.
And there's also a sense of it taking out some of the anxieties that are there. It's like, talking about the pain, that the sharing of those pain, creating space for that pain to be heard, for someone to fully express the pain and all the experiences behind it, is actually one of the most healing aspects from my experience of pain. It's like it sort of transforms the pain into connection and trust.
So you're relating it back to, we were talking about pain before, and you're saying that really expressing your pain can be one of the most healing experiences. And you've just seen that play out many times.
And what do you do in an environment where it's full of pain and nobody's willing to kind of hold the space for it? So that's what we're trying to do with the culture of empathy is, you know, as mediators or listeners, we're going out and offering listening to at least kind of prime the pump. You know, somebody's got to kind of start priming the pump. And that's what, you know, one of the goals or, I don't know, what is it? That's one of the things I see for creating more empathy is somebody's got to kind of start the ball rolling.
Mm.
And not to say that it's not going. There's tons of empathy. People are very empathic, you know, very sensitive to each other. But really this deeper culture of empathy, you know, there's still a lot of problems, you know, blocks to that.
Mm. So you acknowledge that there is a lot of empathy in the world and between people, but there's some deeper problems that maybe this can solve, and just want to instill it more into the culture. And that would help fix some of these problems that we see where there's a lot of pain. And when everyone's feeling a lot of pain and no one is really feeling included or able to speak their mind.
Yeah. And the other thing that comes up is that Google was
It's time. I forgot to start the timer, but
no, yeah. That's time. Okay. I feel heard. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I'll talk to Lou, and I guess I just want to express, like, I feel, or I appreciate, you know, all that both of you have said, and feel like I've learned a lot in this conversation and got to hear a lot of different perspectives. And in particular, I liked how you tried to lay out that what you meant by there are these, like, everyone is the same in that we all feel these core emotions and we all have these core wants. But what's different is that how we go after those wants and how we try to protect ourselves, maybe. So I found that really useful, and I'm actually interested to hear more about that, maybe like a book or something.
That my learning about that comes from, oh, sorry. Do you want me to, I'll reflect back on what you said. Are we finishing now? Are we finishing up, or are we?
We could just do some open dialogue if you'd like to just reflect and let go of the structure.
Okay. So I hear your appreciation, and you're saying that learning about that part that I talked about was valuable to you. It comes from nonviolent communication, which was invented by Marshall Rosenberg. So he has a book. He has several books that are great.
All right. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm also grateful for this conversation, opportunity to understand you better, James, and to have a dialogue about empathy and its value. I think, you know, in trying to create a more empathic world, or even just help people understand what empathy is. And I'm curious, James, you know, you saying that you're on the autism spectrum. I'm curious. Well, I guess you've already said. I was just curious about all the things we said about empathy and what you think you can use from that. And I guess you already said, you know, this idea of the looking for the needs. You know, what is the human need underneath what I'm seeing or hearing? Right. That's been really valuable for me. And if that's a strategy you're thinking of pursuing in terms of trying to understand people, I think that works. I think that works for people off the spectrum, but I'm guessing you're saying for you think that might be something that you can use because sometimes you have trouble reading other things or feeling emotion.
Yeah. I don't know that I necessarily have deficits in feeling emotion, but definitely I don't necessarily have the same emotional connections or connotations to certain concepts that other people have. And so at least I see this like breakdown of there are these different emotions and needs that people have as the underlying rules of the system. So it would help me understand these things as a system, at least.
Right, it's part of that systematizing, using
Right.
systematizing.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I guess also, I do want to acknowledge that I think, correcting for past things and, redistribution behavior programs can be good. And I think some people are too individualistic in saying like, no, we should never do these things. But like, I do think people, perceive these group differences and group identities of people. And so, that creates stereotypes, and those stereotypes have effects on people. And so I do think that there is room to have these programs. So I'm not like an extreme individualist in that way.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess just more communication between some of the very individualist people and others, like there needs to be more communication, I guess.
Yeah, and that's really what we're trying to do with this track here, is how might we have more of that communication and that dialogue. So we can, going forward, we can bring in some of those people. If any of the extreme individualists, or we can bring them into these dialogues. And I'm open to having as many as you're open for. I really enjoy this. I've got like tons. Like we didn't even talk about shaming, more about dialogue and the relationship of empathy and shame. So there's a lot more I would love to talk about, as well as, bring in more people who, with those different perspectives, and kind of hope make a larger circle. So
I want to say something about what you said, Edwin, about empathy taking time. Because I think that's one of the reasons, certainly like in a business environment, one of the complaints I hear is that we don't have time for that. And I disagree. Well, building trust takes time. Being empathic actually doesn't take a huge amount of time. To respond to someone in an empathic manner when they are having difficulty takes just as much time as responding to them in a judgmental manner. It's just it creates a different atmosphere. Creating a culture of empathy where people feel safe and included and there's trust, that takes time. That doesn't happen instantly, because it's built up out of people's interactions with each other. And if you have a culture that is not particularly safe, and that is where there is a lot of judgment, and it's highly competitive or something like that, it takes time to shift that. But I think empathy itself to be empathic doesn't take a lot more time than to be judgmental. It's just a matter of where you are coming from. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I would say, yeah. So there's a lot more, we can discuss, going forward. We have some more circles lined up. If you want to continue this, having, 2.0, second follow-up, I'm open for that. So it's pretty much your call. You did say you were open, James, to having dialogues with some, opening the circle. So we definitely have that, to schedule. And so open for, anything that, you'd like to do in terms of going to continue a second circle with Lou and I, or whatever. So it's pretty much your call.
Yeah, definitely open. I think there's still more to explore, I guess.
Okay. Great. Well, then with that, I want to thank both of you. It's been delightful, and to be continued.
Okay, thank you.
And I think I'm going to close the call now. We're all going to just drop out. So
okay, bye, James.
Right.
It's nice meeting you.
Bye. Nice meeting you.
All right.
Yeah.